The November fog of 1891 had settled upon London with the persistence of an unwelcome guest, transforming the familiar streets into a maze of ghostly shadows and muffled sounds. From our sitting-room window at 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps below appeared as mere halos floating in the sulphurous gloom, while the occasional clatter of hooves and wheels emerged from the murk like voices from another world. It was weather that seemed to press upon the very soul, and I confess that the warmth of our fire and the comfort of our familiar quarters felt doubly precious against such atmospheric hostility. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, had spent the greater part of the afternoon in that peculiar state of restless energy which invariably seized him during periods of professional inactivity. The criminal classes of London appeared to have entered a state of seasonal hibernation, leaving Holmes to pace our rooms like a caged panther, alternately examining specimens under his microscope and subjecting his violin to tortuous experiments in musical discord. I had learned to recognize the signs of this particular malady and knew better than to attempt conversation during such episodes. I had settled myself by the fire with the latest issue of the British Medical Journal, though I confess my attention was more often drawn to Holmes than to the learned articles before me. He stood now at the window, his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the pale light filtering through the fog, his fingers drumming an irregular tattoo upon the glass. "You are wondering," he said suddenly, without turning from the window, "whether this enforced idleness has finally driven me to the brink of madness, or whether some subtle sign has indicated to me that our period of tranquility is about to end." I set down my journal with a smile, no longer surprised by such demonstrations of his remarkable powers of observation. "My dear Holmes, you continue to astonish me with your ability to read my thoughts." "Thoughts, Watson?" He turned from the window, his grey eyes bright with that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction. "I read no thoughts, merely the physical manifestations thereof. You have glanced in my direction no fewer than 6 times in the past quarter hour, each time with increasing duration. Your journal has remained open to the same page for 10 minutes, suggesting your attention is elsewhere engaged. Moreover, your fingers have twice moved toward your watch chain, indicating a concern with the passage of time, and you have shifted position in your chair to achieve a better view of my activities." "Guilty on all counts," I admitted, "though I maintain there is something almost supernatural in your ability to interpret such subtle signs." Holmes moved to his armchair and reached for his pipe, his movements betraying that curious combination of languid grace and coiled energy that characterized him when his mind was fully engaged. "The supernatural, my dear fellow, is merely the natural, imperfectly understood. Every human emotion, every thought, produces its corresponding physical response. It is simply a matter of training oneself to observe these responses and draw the logical conclusions." Before I could reply to this characteristically confident assertion, we were interrupted by the sharp jangling of the bell below, followed immediately by the sound of rapid footsteps upon our stairs. Holmes paused in the act of lighting his pipe, his head cocked to one side like a hound catching an interesting scent. "A visitor," he murmured, "and one in a state of considerable agitation, judging by the irregular cadence of the ascent. Official, I think. The measured tread despite the haste suggests professional training. Lestrade, unless I am much mistaken." The door burst open to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his thin, ferret-like features flushed with exertion and excitement. His usual air of professional self-importance was overlaid with genuine bewilderment, and I could see from the tension in his shoulders that he carried news of unusual significance. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped without his customary preliminaries. "Thank heaven you're in. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years at the Yard. It's impossible, Mr. Holmes, absolutely impossible." Holmes gestured toward a chair while I moved to pour brandy from the decanter. "Pray compose yourself, Lestrade. You will find that the impossible, when properly examined, invariably reveals itself to be merely the improbable. What has brought you out in such weather?" Lestrade accepted the brandy gratefully, though his hands trembled slightly as he raised the glass. "It's murder, Mr. Holmes, or something very like it." "But the circumstances?" He shook his head, as if trying to clear away cobwebs of confusion. "Sir Reginald Pembroke is dead." The name was not unknown to me. The railway magnate? The man who consolidated the northern lines. "The very same, Doctor. One of the wealthiest men in England, and now he's lying dead in his study at Pembroke House in Belgravia." Lestrade leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "But here's the thing that's got us all baffled, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald died twice last night, in 2 different places, at exactly the same time. Holmes, who had been in the process of lighting his pipe, froze with the match halfway to the bowl." "I beg your pardon." "You heard me right, sir. At precisely 11:30 last night, Sir Reginald was found dead in his locked study at Pembroke House, shot through the heart at close range. The door was bolted from the inside, the windows were secured, and his own revolver was lying beside the body. Clear case of suicide, you'd think." "But?" Holmes prompted, his eyes now bright with interest. "But at the exact same time, 11:30 by the clock, Sir Reginald Pembroke collapsed and died in the smoking room of his club in Pall Mall, witnessed by no fewer than 4 members, including Lord Ashworth and Colonel Morrison. The club's physician examined him immediately and pronounced him dead of apparent heart failure." I stared at the inspector in bewilderment. Surely there must be some error in the timing, or perhaps a case of mistaken identity. "That's what I thought at first, Doctor. But both bodies have been positively identified. Lady Pembroke herself viewed the body at Belgravia and swore it was her husband. The club members are equally certain of their identification. Both bodies bear the same distinctive scar on the left hand from a childhood accident, the same gold signet ring, the same personal effects." Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace the room, his pipe forgotten in his hand. "You present me with a fascinating paradox, Lestrade. A man cannot be in 2 places at once, yet you have witnesses to both events. One body shows signs of violent death, the other of natural causes. Both are identified as the same individual by people who knew him well." "Exactly, Mr. Holmes. The chief inspector is ready to write it off as some sort of elaborate hoax or coincidence, but I've seen both bodies myself. It's the same man. I'd stake my career on it." "But how can that be possible?" Holmes stopped his pacing and fixed Lestrade with that piercing stare I knew so well. "It cannot be possible, which means we are dealing with a deception of extraordinary sophistication. Tell me, have the bodies been moved?" "The one from the club was taken to Pembroke House at the family's request. They're both there now, in separate rooms. The family is in complete shock, as you might imagine. Lady Pembroke has requested absolute discretion. If this gets out to the press before we can make sense of it, the scandal will be enormous." Holmes moved to the window and gazed out at the fog-shrouded street, his profile sharp against the pale light. "When did these deaths occur in relation to Sir Reginald's usual habits? Was he expected at both locations?" "That's another peculiar thing, sir. According to his valet, Sir Reginald left home at 9 o'clock for his club, as was his custom every Tuesday evening. He was seen arriving at the club at 9:30, had dinner, and was observed in the smoking room until approximately 11:15. Then, somehow, he was simultaneously dying in both places at 11:30. "And the locked study. Who discovered that body?" "The butler, when Sir Reginald failed to appear for his usual nightcap at midnight. Found the door locked from the inside, had to break it down. Sir Reginald was slumped over his desk, the revolver beside him. Powder burns on his waistcoat." Holmes turned from the window, and I saw in his expression that familiar combination of intellectual excitement and grim determination that always accompanied the beginning of a truly challenging case. "Watson, your coat and medical bag. Lestrade, I trust the scene has been preserved exactly as found." "As much as possible, sir, though the family physician has examined both bodies." "Then we must make haste. The fog will provide us with cover, and I am most eager to examine these impossible corpses before any more well-meaning interference obscures the truth." Holmes was already reaching for his coat and hat. This case promises to test the very limits of logical deduction, and I confess I find myself quite stimulated by the challenge. As we prepared to venture into the fog-bound streets, Holmes paused at the door and turned to me with that slight smile which always preceded his most brilliant demonstrations. "Mark my words, Watson. Before this night is over, we shall discover that the man who died twice is neither supernatural phenomenon nor coincidence, but rather the product of a mind every bit as devious as it is desperate. The game, as they say, is afoot." The hansom cab that carried us through the murky streets toward Belgravia moved slowly through the fog, and I found myself contemplating the impossible puzzle that awaited us. In all my years of association with Sherlock Holmes, I had witnessed many strange and terrible things, but the prospect of a man who had apparently died twice in the same evening struck me as perhaps the most bizarre circumstance we had yet encountered. Yet as I glanced at my companion, sitting opposite me with his eyes closed and his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep concentration, I felt a familiar surge of confidence. If anyone could unravel this impossible mystery, it was the man beside me. Whatever dark truth lay hidden behind the fog and deception of this November night, I knew that Sherlock Holmes would illuminate it with a brilliant light of pure logic. The adventure of the man who died twice before midnight had begun. The fog thickened as our hansom cab lurched through the narrow streets toward Belgravia, the yellow murk so dense that the gas lamps appeared as mere halos floating in the sulphurous gloom. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey, his angular profile occasionally illuminated by the wavering light from passing street lamps. I knew better than to interrupt his contemplations, yet I found myself wrestling with the impossible paradox that awaited us. How could one man die twice, in two different locations, at precisely the same moment? Pembroke House loomed before us like a great stone leviathan emerging from the fog, its Georgian facade gleaming wetly in the lamplight. The imposing structure spoke of old money and established power, yet tonight its tall windows blazed with an urgency that suggested a household in considerable turmoil. As we mounted the broad stone steps, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains and caught the sound of hushed, agitated voices filtering through the heavy oak door. Lestrade's knock was answered immediately by the same butler who had appeared in our Baker Street rooms. Hargreaves, his composure now thoroughly shattered by the evening's extraordinary events. His hands trembled visibly as he took our coats, and his eyes bore the red-rimmed appearance of a man who had witnessed something beyond his understanding. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the fog-muffled sounds of the street. "Lady Pembroke has retired to her chambers under the physician's care. The bodies remain exactly as you left them, sir. I have allowed no one near either room." "Excellent, Hargreaves," Holmes replied, his manner brisk yet not unkind. "Your discretion serves your master well, even in death. Now show us to the study. I wish to examine the locked room before we proceed further." We followed the trembling servant down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced Pembroke ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track our progress with aristocratic disapproval. The study door bore the violent scars of forced entry, splintered wood around the lock and bolt mechanism that had been wrenched from its housing. A uniformed constable stood guard, saluting smartly as Lestrade produced his key. The study itself was a gentleman's sanctuary, paneled in rich mahogany and lined with leather-bound volumes that spoke of wealth tempered by scholarly pursuits. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, and slumped across its polished surface was the body of Sir Reginald Pembroke. Even in death, he retained an air of authority, his silver hair immaculately groomed, his evening dress impeccable save for the dark stain that had spread across his waistcoat and onto the Persian carpet beneath. Holmes approached the scene with the focused intensity of a predator, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. He examined the windows first, testing each latch and studying the dust-laden sills with his magnifying glass. "Genuine security," he murmured. "These windows have not been opened in weeks. The door was indeed bolted from within when forced. Observe the fresh wood splinters and the position of the bolt mechanism." Moving to the body, Holmes conducted his examination with surgical precision. The revolver lay beside the dead man's right hand, and I noted immediately the powder burns on the waistcoat that indicated a discharge at extremely close range. Yet as Holmes lifted Sir Reginald's hand for closer inspection, his expression grew thoughtful. "Watson, your medical opinion on the wound trajectory and the condition of the hands, if you please." I moved forward to conduct my own examination. The bullet had entered the left side of the chest, penetrating the heart and causing instantaneous death. Rigor mortis was well advanced, confirming death had occurred hours earlier. Yet as I examined the hands, I noticed what had caught Holmes's attention. "The fingers show remarkably little powder residue," I observed. "For a weapon discharged at such close range, there should be distinct traces on both the thumb and forefinger. Moreover, the wound angle suggests the weapon was held at an awkward position, almost as though someone else held it," Holmes finished quietly. "Observe also the absence of cadaveric spasm in the fingers. A man shooting himself through the heart would likely maintain his grip on the weapon due to the sudden muscular contraction at the moment of death. Yet this revolver lies loosely, as if placed rather than dropped." Holmes moved to the desk, where scattered papers lay beneath a silver inkstand. Among them, a half-finished letter caught his attention, its ink still dark against the cream-colored paper. "To his solicitor," Holmes noted, reading aloud, "I have reason to believe that I am the victim of a most diabolical plot, one which threatens not only my fortune, but my very life." He paused, lifting the blotting pad beside the letter to examine the reversed impressions pressed into its surface. "Fascinating," he murmured, though he did not elaborate on what he had discovered. Instead, he straightened and surveyed the room once more, his expression grave. "This death was staged with considerable care, yet the staging contains fundamental flaws that betray its artificial nature. Someone wished us to believe Sir Reginald took his own life in this locked room, but they overlooked crucial details that reveal the deception." "But how did the murderer escape?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes smiled thinly. "That, Inspector, is indeed the question. But first, let us examine the second Sir Reginald, the gentleman who managed to die elsewhere at precisely the same moment. I suspect his story will prove equally illuminating." We left the study in contemplative silence, the weight of that first impossible death pressing upon us as we followed Hargreaves through the shadowed corridors of Pembroke House. The butler's composure had deteriorated further, his hands trembling visibly as he led us toward the morning room where the second body had been placed. The gas jets had been turned low throughout this wing of the house, casting long, wavering shadows that transformed the portraits of stern Pembroke ancestors into a gallery of judging spectres, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with aristocratic disapproval. The morning room itself was a chamber of pale green silk wallpaper and delicate furnishings that seemed ill-suited to house the grim reality of death. The air carried a chill that spoke of windows left open to dispel the oppressive atmosphere, mingled with the faint scent of camphor and hothouse lilies that someone had arranged in a futile attempt to mask the presence of mortality. Upon a daybed in the center of the room lay the second Sir Reginald Pembroke, positioned with the artificial repose that servants arrange when death has visited unexpectedly. I confess that a cold shiver traced the length of my spine as I looked down at the face. It was identical in every particular to the man we had just left slumped over the mahogany desk. The same aquiline nose, the same distinctive silver whiskers brushed carefully back from the temples, the same high forehead that spoke of intelligence and authority. Yet this man's expression bore a look of profound surprise rather than peaceful resignation, and his evening clothes, while identical in style to those worn by the body in the study, showed no signs of violence whatsoever. Heart failure, according to the club physician, Lestrade offered from his position near the doorway, clearly unnerved by this perfect duplicate. Dr. Sterling examined him immediately after the collapse and signed the certificate on the spot. Said Sir Reginald just clutched his chest and dropped like a stone while enjoying his after-dinner cigar. Holmes circled the body with the methodical precision of a naturalist examining an exotic specimen, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. He produced his magnifying glass and studied the face, the hands, the clothing with such intensity that several minutes passed in absolute silence. I watched as he lifted each hand in turn, examining the fingernails and paying particular attention to the distinctive crescent-shaped scar on the left hand that matched precisely the marking we had observed on the first body. "Watson, your professional assessment, if you please," Holmes commanded, stepping back to allow me access to the corpse. "Take your time and be thorough. Note any peculiarities, however slight they may appear." I approached the examination with the systematic care Holmes had taught me over our years of collaboration. The body was that of a man in his late 50s, well-nourished and showing signs of comfortable living. The face bore no marks of violence, though I noted immediately a slight bluish discoloration around the lips that suggested something more sinister than simple heart failure. When I pulled down the lower eyelids, the conjunctiva showed the telltale congestion of impaired oxygenation, and the pupils were markedly dilated beyond what I would expect from natural death. "The rigor mortis is quite advanced," I observed, pressing my fingers against the chest, more so than I would expect given that death reportedly occurred only hours ago. The discoloration around the mouth, combined with a pupil dilation, suggests possible poisoning, likely something acting rapidly upon the cardiac system while also affecting the blood's ability to carry oxygen. "Excellent, Watson. Your observations align precisely with my own suspicions." Holmes returned to the body and lifted the right hand, extending the fingers for my closer inspection. "Now, examine these hands with particular care. Compare them in your mind to those we observed in the study." I studied the hands with renewed attention and immediately noticed what had caught Holmes's sharp eye. "They're remarkably soft," I said, "almost feminine in their delicacy. The nails are perfectly manicured, but there's a complete absence of the calluses one would expect from a man who regularly handles papers and pens. The skin has an unusual waxy texture, and the fingertips show a roughness that seems inconsistent with clerical work." "Precisely." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that fierce intelligence that always preceded a breakthrough. "The hands in the study showed the expected signs of a businessman: slight calluses on the writing fingers, ink stains, the firmness of skin that comes from regular manipulation of documents. These hands tell an entirely different story." Before Holmes could elaborate further, we were interrupted by a voice from the doorway. "There is no twin, gentlemen." We turned to see a young man standing in the entrance, his face pale and his evening dress somewhat disheveled. He bore a passing resemblance to the dead man, though his features were softer, his chin less determined, and beads of perspiration stood out on his forehead despite the room's chill. "Mr. Arthur Pembroke," Lestrade introduced quickly. "Sir Reginald's nephew and heir." Holmes straightened, his penetrating gaze fixed upon the newcomer. "Mr. Pembroke, you can positively identify this man as your uncle." I don't know what to think," the young man stammered, gripping the door frame for support. "I saw the body in the study. It is Uncle Reginald, without question. But this—" He gestured helplessly toward the daybed. "This is also him. I was at the club tonight, you see. I spoke to him not 20 minutes before he collapsed. He was his usual self, complaining about the liberal policies and discussing the coal prices. And yet, the police tell me he was locked in his study all evening." Holmes moved closer to the heir, his voice dropping to that dangerous purr I knew so well. "You conversed with him at length. Did you observe anything unusual in his manner? Any hesitation in speech, any lapse in memory regarding family matters?" "None whatsoever," Arthur insisted, though his nervousness was palpable. He was smoking his preferred brand of Cuban cigar. He wore his favorite signet ring. He even inquired specifically about my mother's health and mentioned a business matter we had discussed last week. "And yet," Holmes said, returning to the corpse with renewed purpose, "there is a singular discrepancy that reveals the true nature of this deception." He lifted the left hand once more, angling it toward the gaslight. "Watson, examine the fingertips of this hand with your magnifying glass. Tell me what you observe." I bent close with the glass and immediately saw what had escaped my initial examination. "The fingertips show distinct calluses," I said with growing excitement. "The skin is hardened on the tips of the index, middle, and ring fingers, the exact pattern one would expect from a violinist," Holmes finished triumphantly, "or possibly a cellist. These are the calluses formed by years of pressing strings against a fingerboard, not the marks of a man who made his fortune in railways and spent his days signing contracts and correspondence." Arthur Pembroke's face went ashen. "But that's impossible. Uncle Reginald had no musical abilities whatsoever. He often joked that he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." Holmes reached into the waistcoat pocket of the corpse, the one place that had been overlooked in the initial examination. He withdrew a small, crumpled piece of paper and smoothed it carefully. It was not a club receipt or calling card, but rather a third-class railway ticket stub from Liverpool, dated just 2 days prior. "The plot thickens considerably," Holmes murmured, his eyes narrowing as he held the ticket up to the gaslight. "We have before us not Sir Reginald Pembroke, but a musician from Liverpool who possessed an extraordinary resemblance to the baronet. Extraordinary enough to fool even close family members for an entire evening." He turned to Lestrade with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Inspector, this room must be secured immediately. We are dealing with a conspiracy of staggering sophistication, one that required intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits, appearance, and personal relationships." Holmes pocketed the ticket and moved toward the door with renewed energy. "The suicide in the locked study now takes on an entirely different complexion. If this man could successfully impersonate Sir Reginald at his own club, fooling friends and family alike, then we must reconsider everything we believe about the death in the study. Watson, we return immediately to examine that scene with fresh eyes. I believe the true Sir Reginald Pembroke has a great deal more to tell us, now that we know his shadow came from the music halls of Liverpool." The revelation of the Liverpool impostor had transformed our entire perspective, and as we returned to the study, the very air seemed charged with new possibilities. Holmes moved with renewed purpose, his keen eyes no longer seeing the obvious tableau of suicide, but searching for the subtle traces of a more sinister truth. The fog continued to press against the windows like grasping fingers, while within the room the gas lamps cast their unwavering light upon what we now knew to be an elaborate stage set designed to deceive. "We have been looking at this scene through the lens of the impossible," Holmes declared, approaching the body with fresh intensity. "A man cannot be in 2 places at once, therefore we assumed supernatural circumstances. But now we know that 2 different men died at the same moment, by different means, in different locations. The question becomes not how Sir Reginald could be in 2 places, but why someone wanted us to believe he was." He knelt beside the desk, examining the carpet with his magnifying glass. "Observe, Watson, these faint indentations in the pile. Someone stood here for an extended period, shifting their weight nervously. And here, beside the chair leg, the telltale scratches where something thin and strong was pulled taut. Rising, he moved to the door and examined the bolt mechanism with minute attention. Aha! Tiny metal filings around the bolt housing, and here, a single strand of fishing line caught in the mechanism." "Fishing line?" Lestrade asked, bewildered. The oldest locked room trick in the criminal's handbook, Inspector, executed with modern materials. A loop of strong fishing line passed around the bolt handle and threaded under the door or through the keyhole. The murderer exits, pulls the line to slide the bolt home, then retrieves the line by pulling one end of the loop. Simple, effective, and requiring only that the bolt be well oiled beforehand. I watched as Holmes demonstrated the mechanism, his long fingers tracing the path the line would have taken, but surely someone would have noticed such preparation. Indeed, Watson, which brings us to our next revelation. Holmes moved to examine the body more closely, lifting Sir Reginald's right hand with careful precision. Look at the shirt cuff, the inside surface, near the wrist button. Do you see that reddish-brown stain? I peered closely at the crisp white linen. Dried blood, certainly, but in a most unusual position. Precisely. If Sir Reginald had shot himself, blood spatter would appear on the outside of the cuff, facing the wound. For blood to stain the inside of the cuff, his hand must have been raised defensively, palm outward, while someone else fired the shot. This was murder, gentlemen, staged with considerable sophistication. Holmes turned his attention to the fireplace, where he carefully extracted fragments of charred paper from the dying embers. Someone burned evidence here, and recently. This appears to be the backing card from a professional photograph. Heavy stock, cream-colored, and these metal fragments suggest the destruction of a picture frame as well. A photograph of what? I inquired. Of Sir Reginald himself, I suspect. The impostor would have needed detailed visual reference to perfect his disguise. But more significantly, someone with access to this room prepared the bolt mechanism, burned the evidence, and possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits and appearance. Lestrade consulted his notebook. The butler mentioned that a housemaid was dismissed yesterday for theft. Sarah, her name was. She allegedly stole a silver picture frame and some of Sir Reginald's old clothing. Holmes's eyes blazed with triumph. The costume for our Liverpool musician. But who reported this convenient theft? Who had reason to dismiss the one person who might have noticed the preparation of this room? Mr. Arthur Pembroke reported the theft, Lestrade admitted reluctantly. Said he saw the girl leaving with a bundle. Arthur Pembroke, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. The grieving nephew who was so conveniently present at the club to witness the death of the impostor, the heir who stands to inherit everything upon his uncle's demise, the young man who had both motive and opportunity to orchestrate this elaborate deception. Holmes moved to the desk and examined the scattered papers once more. Among them, he found a telegram that had arrived earlier that evening. Arrangement proceeds as discussed. Expect delivery by 9 o'clock. The message was unsigned and bore a Piccadilly postmark. The timeline becomes clear, Holmes continued. Arthur arranges for the impostor to arrive from Liverpool, trains him in Sir Reginald's mannerisms using photographs and personal items stolen by the conveniently dismissed maid. This evening, while the impostor performs at the club, Arthur returns here, confronts his uncle, perhaps demanding money or threatening exposure of some family secret, and when refused, shoots him. He then stages the suicide scene, locks the room using the prepared fishing line mechanism, and returns to the club in time to witness the impostor's death from poison, a death timed to coincide with the discovery of Sir Reginald's body. But the medical evidence suggests both men died at the same time, I protested. The impostor died at 11:30 as planned. Sir Reginald may have died somewhat earlier, but the cold fog admitted through an opened window would have accelerated the body's cooling, confusing our estimation of the time of death. Arthur then returned, closed the window, completed the staging, and prepared to discover the theft that would implicate the dismissed servant. Holmes straightened, his face grim with determination. We must find Arthur Pembroke immediately, Lestrade. I suspect our grieving nephew is at this very moment destroying additional evidence or preparing his next deception. The man who arranged for someone to die twice has proven himself capable of extraordinary duplicity, and I doubt his schemes end with his uncle's death. The fog seemed to thicken as we prepared to confront the true architect of this elaborate murder, and I could not shake the feeling that our most dangerous moments lay ahead. Arthur Pembroke was not to be found in the drawing room where we had left him, but our search proved mercifully brief. The sound of books falling heavily to the floor led us to the small library adjoining Sir Reginald's study, where we discovered the young heir in a state of frantic desperation. Through the partially open door, we observed him pulling volumes from their shelves with trembling hands, his earlier composure entirely shattered. His face glistened with perspiration despite the room's chill, and his movements possessed the jerky quality of a man pursued by demons both real and imagined. "Mr. Pembroke," Holmes announced, pushing the door fully open with deliberate authority. The young man spun around with such violence that the leather-bound volume in his hands went tumbling to the carpet with a dull thud. His eyes, wide with panic, darted frantically between Holmes, Lestrade, and myself, seeking some avenue of escape that did not exist. "Mr. Holmes, I was merely searching for my uncle's will," he stammered, the lie transparent even to his own ears. "I thought perhaps he had concealed a copy among his books." Holmes stepped into the room with that predatory grace I had observed countless times before, his grey eyes fixed upon Arthur with unwavering intensity. And I could see the young man visibly shrinking beneath that penetrating stare. "A curious place to seek legal documents, Mr. Pembroke, among volumes of romantic poetry and travel memoirs. Unless, of course, you search not for testamentary papers, but for something far more incriminating. Perhaps correspondence relating to a certain musician from Liverpool." The effect of Holmes's words was immediate and devastating. Arthur Pembroke recoiled as if struck by a physical blow, his back pressing against the reading table until his knuckles turned white from gripping its edge. The careful facade he had maintained throughout the evening crumbled entirely, revealing the terrified young man beneath. "I don't know what you mean," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "That impostor, I had nothing to do with him. Come now," Holmes continued relentlessly. "We have already uncovered the mechanism of your deception, the dismissed housemaid Sarah who so conveniently stole clothing and a photograph frame. The fishing line used to secure the study door from the outside, the burned evidence in the fireplace. Your elaborate theatrical performance has been exposed, sir. The only remaining question concerns your motive for murdering both your uncle and his double." "No!" The word burst from Arthur's lips with such force that both Lestrade and I stepped forward instinctively. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He wasn't supposed to die." Holmes paused in his advance, his expression shifting from accusation to intense scrutiny. "Explain yourself, Mr. Pembroke. And I warn you, any further deception will only worsen your position." The young man's composure collapsed entirely. Tears streamed down his face as he sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. "I didn't kill Uncle Reginald," he sobbed. "I swear before God I didn't. Yes, I hired the actor. Thomas Blackwood was his name. I found him in a Liverpool music hall. The resemblance was uncanny, almost supernatural. But I only wanted him to impersonate Uncle for one evening." "For what purpose?" Lestrade demanded, producing his handcuffs. "The railway merger documents," Arthur cried desperately. "The Northern Consolidation Papers had to be signed by midnight tonight. Uncle Reginald refused. He said the terms would ruin thousands of small investors. But I had already committed to the consortium. My gambling debts, they threatened to kill me if the papers weren't signed." Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden understanding. "So you arranged for your actor to sign the documents at the club, witnessed by Lord Ashworth and Colonel Morrison? Members of this consortium, no doubt?" "Exactly. Thomas was perfect. He signed the papers flawlessly at 11 o'clock. But then—" Arthur's voice broke. Then he collapsed, just raised his glass in a toast and dropped dead. I was watching from the shadows. Terrified, I rushed back here to confess everything to Uncle Reginald, to beg his forgiveness and help. But when I arrived, I heard a gunshot from the study just before midnight. Not at 11:30 as everyone assumes." Holmes stared at the trembling young man, his brilliant mind clearly reassessing every element of the case. "You heard the shot after returning from the club? That places Sir Reginald's death nearly 30 minutes later than the impostor's." "Yes, I swear it. Everyone thinks they died simultaneously because of the club witnesses, but I heard that terrible sound myself." Holmes began pacing the small library with renewed energy, his movements sharp and decisive. "Watson, we have been examining the shadow while ignoring the substance. If Arthur speaks truthfully and his terror appears genuine, then we face a third player in this deadly game. Someone who knew of the impersonation scheme and used it as cover for their own murderous design." "But who would want both men dead?" I asked, struggling to follow this new thread. "Someone who needed the forged signature to stand legally," Holmes replied grimly. "But who also required Sir Reginald's permanent silence? Tell me, Mr. Pembroke, if you were convicted of these murders, who would inherit your uncle's estate?" Arthur looked up with dawning horror. "My cousin Julian," he whispered. "Julian Thorne. He's a chemist by training." Holmes's face went pale. "And where, pray tell, is Mr. Thorne at this moment?" "Here in the house, the guest wing. He claimed a headache and retired early." Arthur's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Dear God, what have I done?" Holmes spun toward the door with explosive energy. "Lestrade, the guest wing, immediately. If our deductions prove correct, we may yet apprehend the true architect of this diabolical scheme. A man cold enough to poison one victim while shooting another, all while manipulating his own cousin into providing the perfect misdirection." We raced from the library, leaving Arthur Pembroke slumped in his chair, no longer a suspect, but a pawn in a game far more sinister than any of us had imagined. The guest wing lay shrouded in an oppressive silence that seemed to press against our very souls as we made our way along the dimly lit corridor. The gas jets burned low here, casting wavering shadows that transformed the elegant wallpaper into a tapestry of menace. Holmes moved with predatory grace, his revolver drawn but held low, while Lestrade followed with the heavy tread of official authority. The revelation of Julian Thorne's existence had provided the final piece of our deadly puzzle, yet I could not shake the feeling that our most dangerous moments lay immediately ahead. We reached the door marked with a small brass nameplate bearing Thorne's name. Holmes pressed his ear against the polished wood, listening with that extraordinary concentration that seemed to shut out all other sensation. After several tense seconds, he straightened and gestured for us to take positions on either side of the entrance. "He is within," Holmes whispered, "and very much aware of our approach. I can hear the faint sounds of careful movement, papers being arranged, perhaps evidence being concealed. We must proceed with extreme caution." Without further warning, Holmes turned the handle and stepped boldly into the chamber. "Mr. Julian Thorne," he announced in a voice that carried the authority of absolute certainty, "I believe you have been expecting us." The scene that greeted us was one of deceptive tranquility that made the underlying menace all the more chilling. Thorne sat in an elegant armchair beside the fireplace, a book resting casually in his lap, a glass of amber liquid on the small table at his elbow. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, with sharp, aristocratic features and pale eyes that regarded our dramatic entrance with an expression of mild curiosity rather than alarm. Yet I noticed immediately the telltale signs of nervous energy. The slight tremor in his fingers, the too careful arrangement of objects on the nearby desk, the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the room's comfortable temperature. "Gentlemen," Thorne said with studied calm, closing his book with deliberate slowness. "To what do I owe this rather theatrical interruption? I trust my cousin Arthur has been helpful in your inquiries regarding my uncle's tragic suicide." Holmes advanced into the room, his keen eyes already cataloguing every detail of the carefully arranged scene. Your cousin has indeed been most illuminating, Mr. Thorne. He has explained the mechanics of his foolish impersonation scheme, a clumsy affair that provided the perfect camouflage for a far more sophisticated crime. I fear you speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes. Do I? Holmes moved to the desk, where I could see the scattered remnants of chemical apparatus. Glass vials, a portable spirit lamp, and several small bottles containing various powders and liquids. Then perhaps these will clarify matters. Prussic acid, if I'm not mistaken. Hydrocyanic acid in a concentrated solution. Precisely the substance required to simulate heart failure in a man of middle years, particularly when administered in wine at a gentleman's club. For the first time, a flicker of genuine concern crossed Thorne's composed features. I am a chemist by training, Mr. Holmes. Such substances are the tools of my profession. Indeed they are. And you employed them with considerable skill last evening, while your cousin watched his hired impostor collapse at the club. You were busy in your uncle's study, were you not? The secret passage behind the bookcase provided convenient access, an architectural feature you would certainly know from childhood visits. Thorne's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his waistcoat pocket, but Holmes was ready for such a gesture. I would advise against any sudden movements, Mr. Thorne. Inspector Lestrade is remarkably quick with his handcuffs. You have a vivid imagination, Mr. Holmes, but imagination is not evidence. Is it not? Holmes stepped closer, his voice dropping to that dangerous purr I knew so well. Then perhaps you can explain the fresh powder burn on your left hand, visible even now despite your attempts to conceal it. A mark consistent with firing a revolver at close range, particularly when the weapon must be positioned awkwardly to simulate suicide. Thorne's eyes darted involuntarily to his hand, and I saw the telltale reddish mark Holmes had observed. Furthermore, Holmes continued relentlessly, I suspect your boots will reveal traces of the distinctive yellow clay found near the construction works on Pall Mall. Clay that would have adhered to your soles during your visit to poison Thomas Blackwood's wine. The mask of calm finally slipped from Thorne's face, revealing the cold calculation beneath. You are remarkably thorough, Mr. Holmes, but you have made one critical error. His hand moved with lightning speed toward the glass on the table, but Holmes was faster. With a sharp blow from his walking stick, he struck Thorne's wrist, sending the glass flying to shatter against the hearth. The liquid hissed ominously as it struck the hot coals. More prussic acid, Holmes observed calmly as Lestrade moved to secure the now defeated murderer. A coward's exit, Thorne. You shall face justice properly. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Julian Thorne slumped in defeat, his elaborate scheme finally unraveled by the inexorable logic of Sherlock Holmes. The arrest of Julian Thorne proceeded with swift efficiency, yet the true satisfaction lay not in the capture itself, but in the complete unraveling of his elaborate deception. As Lestrade secured the prisoner with professional thoroughness, Holmes remained in the guest chamber, his restless energy undiminished by our apparent victory. I had learned to recognize this particular intensity in my friend, the need to examine every thread of a case until the entire tapestry of crime stood revealed in perfect clarity. The final pieces of our puzzle, Watson, Holmes murmured, moving among the scattered chemical apparatus with the methodical precision of a scientist cataloging specimens. He lifted a small leather-bound notebook from beneath a stack of papers, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Thorne kept detailed records of his preparations. Here, dates corresponding precisely to Arthur's meetings with the Liverpool impostor. And here, most damning of all, calculations for the exact dosage of prussic acid required to ensure cardiac arrest without immediate detection of poisoning. I peered over his shoulder at the cramped notations, feeling a chill at the cold-blooded precision they revealed. 2 hours and 15 minutes from ingestion to effect, when mixed with port wine and consumed after a heavy meal, I read aloud. Good God, Holmes. He timed Blackwood's death like a railway schedule. Indeed. And observe these earlier entries. A complete study of Sir Reginald's evening habits, his preferred seating at the club, even the specific brand of cigars he favoured. Thorne spent weeks preparing this scheme. Holmes moved to the fireplace and carefully extracted additional fragments of charred paper from the dying embers. More evidence burned, though not thoroughly enough. These appeared to be railway share certificates, Northern Consolidated, precisely as we suspected. The certificates, though partially destroyed, bore enough legible text to reveal the scope of Thorne's financial desperation. He had invested not merely his inheritance, but borrowed heavily against future expectations, gambling everything on the railway merger his uncle opposed. The numbers visible on the fragments suggested a sum that would have meant either spectacular wealth or complete ruin. Financial destruction is hardly justification for double murder, I observed, though I had seen enough of human nature in my years with Holmes to understand the terrible mathematics of desperation. Holmes pocketed the evidence with careful precision. For men like Thorne, Watson, financial ruin represents something worse than death. It means the loss of social position, the collapse of carefully constructed respectability. He would rather commit murder than face the humiliation of poverty. He turned to face our prisoner, who sat rigidly under Lestrade's watchful eye, his earlier composure now entirely shattered. "You learned of Arthur's impersonation plot through correspondence carelessly left about," Holmes continued, his grey eyes boring into Thorne with uncomfortable intensity. "Perhaps a letter from the Liverpool theatre manager, or notes regarding the actor's payment. You recognized immediately that Arthur's foolish scheme provided the perfect opportunity for your own design." Thorne remained silent, but his trembling hands betrayed the accuracy of Holmes's deduction. "The beauty of your plan lay in its exploitation of Arthur's guilt," Holmes pressed on relentlessly. "If Sir Reginald died while his impostor performed publicly at the club, suspicion would naturally fall upon the nephew who had arranged the deception. The forged railway documents would stand as legally binding contracts. The estate would pass to Arthur upon his conviction for murder, and then, through the natural workings of inheritance law, to you as next of kin when Arthur hanged for crimes you had committed." The prisoner's facade of defiance finally cracked, and a bitter laugh escaped his lips. "You speak as though calculation were a vice rather than a virtue, Mr. Holmes. My uncle was a sentimental fool who would have destroyed the Northern Consolidated merger out of misplaced concern for small investors. Thousands of pounds would have been lost, my entire future built upon those shares." "Your entire future built upon murder," Holmes corrected coldly. "You poisoned an innocent actor whose only crime was bearing an unfortunate resemblance to your uncle. You murdered Sir Reginald, a man who had shown you nothing but familial kindness. And you would have allowed your own cousin to hang for crimes he did not commit. The timing required extraordinary precision," I added, following the complete architecture of the crime. "You needed Thomas Blackwood to die publicly at the club, witnessed by respectable members of society, while simultaneously ensuring Sir Reginald's death appeared to be suicide in his locked study." Thorne's composure collapsed entirely under our combined scrutiny. "The railway consolidation would have made me wealthy beyond measure," he said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Arthur's forged signature ensured the merger documents were legally binding. With both men dead and Arthur convicted, I would have inherited everything: the estate, the railway shares, the entire Pembroke fortune." "Perfect save for one element you failed to anticipate," Holmes replied with grim satisfaction. "The intervention of logic and criminal investigation. Your elaborate theatrical production has been dismantled, Mr. Thorne." As Lestrade hauled the prisoner to his feet with rough efficiency, I caught sight of Arthur Pembroke hovering in the doorway, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. The young man had been foolish and desperate, but he was no murderer, a distinction that would matter greatly in the legal proceedings to come. "Julian Thorne," Lestrade announced formally, "I arrest you for the willful murders of Sir Reginald Pembroke and Thomas Blackwood, and for conspiracy to commit fraud in the matter of the Northern Consolidated Railway merger." As the constables led Thorne away, His arrogant bearing finally collapsed entirely, leaving only a broken man facing the gallows. Holmes watched him go with that peculiar expression I had come to know well. Satisfaction at justice served, mingled with the melancholy that always gripped him when confronting the depths to which human greed could sink. Yet even as the immediate crisis passed, I sensed that our investigation was not entirely complete. The fog beyond the windows showed signs of lifting, and with the coming dawn, I suspected there would be additional revelations to uncover before this extraordinary case could be considered fully resolved. The grey light of dawn was beginning to penetrate the dissipating fog as we concluded the formalities of Julian Thorne's arrest, yet Holmes showed no signs of fatigue despite our sleepless night. His restless energy remained undiminished, and I recognized the familiar signs of a mind still working at full capacity. Though Thorne's capture would have satisfied any ordinary investigator, my companion's piercing grey eyes suggested that certain elements of this extraordinary case remained unresolved to his exacting standards. We had returned once more to Sir Reginald's study, now empty of its grim occupant, though the dark stain upon the Persian carpet and the splintered wood around the forced lock remained as mute testimony to the night's tragic events. Holmes moved about the chamber with renewed purpose, his keen gaze cataloguing details that had previously been overshadowed by more pressing concerns. "You are troubled by something, Holmes," I observed, noting the familiar tension in his movements. "Indeed, Watson. While the broad architecture of Thorne's crime stands revealed, there are certain financial complexities that require further illumination." He moved to the desk and withdrew the slim, leather-bound ledger he had discovered earlier. "These entries suggest that Thorne's desperation extended far beyond personal ruin. He was managing investment funds belonging to others, prominent individuals whose names, if exposed, would create a scandal of considerable magnitude." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the soft rustle of silk and the measured tread of approaching footsteps. Lady Pembroke appeared in the doorway, supported by her lady's maid but maintaining the dignified bearing that spoke of generations of aristocratic breeding. Despite the terrible circumstances and the early hour, she was impeccably dressed in black mourning attire, her silver hair arranged with perfect propriety, though grief had etched new lines around her eyes and the corners of her mouth. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite its underlying tremor, "I must speak with you regarding matters that may bear upon this dreadful business. Inspector Lestrade mentioned that Julian stands accused of my husband's murder, which I find almost more shocking than the death itself." Holmes rose immediately, his manner combining courtesy with professional directness. "Lady Pembroke, your courage in facing these circumstances is admirable. I fear the evidence against your nephew is substantial, yet there are aspects of this affair that require your assistance to fully understand." She settled into the chair I offered, her hands folded with the disciplined composure of one accustomed to bearing tragedy with dignity. For several weeks before his death, Reginald had been deeply troubled. He received anonymous letters warning that his opposition to the railway merger had created powerful enemies. I urged him to seek police protection, but he dismissed my concerns as feminine anxiety. Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. "These anonymous communications, do they still exist?" Reginald kept all sensitive correspondence in his private safe, concealed behind the portrait of his grandfather. "The combination is known only to myself and our family solicitor, Mr. Weatherby." Without hesitation, Holmes moved to examine the painting of the stern-faced patriarch that dominated one wall of the study. Behind it, as Lady Pembroke had indicated, stood a substantial steel safe bearing the maker's mark of a prestigious London firm. With trembling fingers, she worked the combination, and the heavy door swung open to reveal neat stacks of documents, leather portfolios, and several bundles of correspondence bound with silk ribbon. Holmes extracted the anonymous letters with careful reverence, spreading them across the desk for detailed examination. The threats were written in a deliberately disguised hand on common stationery, yet his trained eye immediately detected elements of significance. Observe the paper quality, Watson. Expensive despite the attempt to appear ordinary. The watermark, partially visible when held to the light, identifies this as Thornton's bond paper, sold exclusively by 3 establishments in London. He studied the handwriting with his magnifying glass. The script appears mechanically altered, yet there is an underlying precision that suggests someone accustomed to technical notation, a chemist's hand attempting common correspondence. Among the other documents, Holmes discovered something that caused his expression to sharpen with intense interest, a comprehensive audit report of the Northern Consolidated Railway accounts, completed just 3 days prior to Sir Reginald's death. The document, bearing the seal of a respected firm of chartered accountants, revealed systematic fraud in the valuation of the railway's assets. "Your husband commissioned this investigation?" Holmes inquired. Lady Pembroke nodded gravely. Reginald suspected irregularities in the merger proposal. He had scheduled a meeting with the Board of Trade for this very morning to present these findings publicly. A meeting that would have exposed Julian Thorne and his fellow conspirators, I observed, understanding the full scope of the motive for murder. Holmes continued examining the safe's contents, discovering additional evidence of the conspiracy's reach. These coded notations beside various entries, they correspond to prominent investors who entrusted funds to Thorne's management. When the merger collapsed, he faced not merely personal bankruptcy but exposure as a reckless speculator with other men's fortunes. Lady Pembroke's composure wavered as the full implications became clear. Then Julian's crime extends far beyond family betrayal. He murdered my husband to silence the one man who could expose a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful figures in London. Precisely, Holmes confirmed. Your husband's death was not merely about inheritance, but about protecting a web of financial fraud that would have ruined careers and toppled reputations throughout the highest levels of society. As the morning sun finally broke through the last remnants of fog, casting golden light through the tall windows, Holmes carefully replaced the documents in the safe. The case that had begun with the impossible paradox of a man dying twice now stood revealed as a conspiracy of staggering sophistication, motivated by greed and desperation on a scale that dwarfed simple murder for inheritance. "There is one element of justice in this tragedy," Holmes observed, turning to Lady Pembroke with the expression of grim satisfaction. "The railway merger documents signed by Arthur's impostor are legally void. Since the signature was forged by someone other than Sir Reginald himself, the contracts hold no legal weight. Your husband's wish to protect the small investors will be honored, albeit posthumously." A tear traced down Lady Pembroke's cheek, though her voice remained controlled. "At least some good may come from this terrible business, but the scandal, Mr. Holmes, the family name, will survive, Lady Pembroke. Julian Thorne's crimes are his own, and Arthur's foolishness, while serious, does not extend to murder. The Pembroke legacy of integrity, exemplified by your husband's final act of protecting innocent investors, will ultimately overshadow this temporary darkness." As we prepared to leave Pembroke House, I reflected on the extraordinary complexity of the case we had unraveled. What had appeared to be an impossible supernatural occurrence had proven to be an all-too-human tragedy of greed, deception, and family betrayal. Yet as I glanced at Holmes, I sensed that even now, certain final elements remained to be addressed before this remarkable investigation could be considered truly complete. The morning air was crisp and clear as we emerged into the awakening streets of Belgravia, the fog that had shrouded our investigation finally lifting to reveal the truth beneath. The pale morning sun streamed through our Baker Street windows as Holmes and I returned from our final interview with the authorities, the fog of the previous evening having lifted to reveal London in sharp, crystalline clarity. Despite our sleepless vigil, my companion showed no signs of fatigue. Indeed, he appeared invigorated by the intellectual satisfaction of a case thoroughly resolved. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with knowing resignation, providing strong coffee and fresh rolls while tactfully ignoring the chemical odors that still clung to Holmes's sleeve and the mud that decorated our boots. Holmes settled into his familiar armchair with characteristic grace, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin as his grey eyes took on that distant focus, which indicated his mind was still engaged in cataloguing and organizing the night's revelations. I'd learned to recognize this particular mood, the need to examine every thread of deduction until the entire tapestry of crime stood revealed in perfect clarity. "You perceive, Watson," he began without preamble, "that this case demonstrates admirably the danger of accepting impossibilities at face value. We were initially confronted with the paradox of a man dying twice simultaneously, a circumstance that, if accepted uncritically, would have led us into superstition rather than along the firm path of logical deduction." I settled opposite him, my notebook already in hand. The hands of the second body provided the crucial revelation, did they not? The calluses that revealed Thomas Blackwood's true profession. Precisely. Sir Reginald's fingers bore the characteristic marks of a businessman, faint calluses from penwork, traces of ink, the firmness that comes from regular handling of documents. Blackwood's hands told an entirely different story, the hardened fingertips of a string musician, utterly foreign to the baronet's habits. Holmes reached for his pipe, his movements precise despite the long night's exertions. That single observation transformed an impossibility into a theatrical deception. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by Inspector Lestrade's familiar tread upon our stairs. He entered with barely concealed satisfaction, his ferret-like features animated by news of significance. "Gentlemen," he announced, settling into the chair I offered, "Julian Thorne has made a full confession. Faced with the gallows, he's turned King's evidence against his fellow conspirators. 3 prominent financiers and a member of Parliament have already been arrested." Holmes nodded with grim satisfaction. A predictable development. Thorne possesses neither the courage to face his crimes nor the loyalty to protect his accomplices. What of the wider implications? The Board of Trade has launched a comprehensive investigation into railway mergers. Several pending consolidations have been suspended. Sir Reginald's final act of integrity continues to bear fruit. Thousands of small investors will be protected from similar fraudulent schemes. "And Arthur Pembroke?" I inquired. "Reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, 5 to 7 years rather than the gallows, given his youth and the circumstances of his manipulation." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. "There remains the matter of collateral victims, Lestrade. Thomas Blackwood leaves a widow and 2 children in Liverpool, dependent upon his music hall earnings. Arthur Pembroke paid him £50 for a single evening's work. A fortune to a struggling musician, yet insufficient compensation for his life." "What do you propose?" Lestrade asked, recognizing the compassion that lay beneath Holmes's austere exterior. "Watson and I shall establish an anonymous fund for Blackwood's family. Additionally, I have written to Lady Pembroke regarding the dismissed housemaid, Sarah Brennan. The girl was manipulated by Arthur's desperation and then discarded with accusations that have destroyed her prospects for honest employment. Justice must extend beyond punishing the guilty to restoring the innocent." Lestrade's expression grew thoughtful. "Lady Pembroke mentioned offering you a reward, some rare manuscript from Sir Reginald's collection." Holmes waved dismissively. "The satisfaction of seeing justice served is sufficient. However, if her ladyship wishes meaningful expression of gratitude, she might consider employing a certain wrongly dismissed servant." As Lestrade departed into the brightening morning, Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his violin. The melancholy strains that emerged spoke of justice achieved, yet lives forever altered by the consequences of human weakness and ambition. "The case presents a fascinating study in criminal psychology, Watson," he observed, setting the instrument aside. Thorne's plan was intricate: the dual deaths, the locked room, the public alibi. Yet it was this very complexity that proved his undoing. Had he simply committed murder and fled, he might have escaped. By constructing the perfect crime, he created a puzzle that demanded solution. The impossible made possible through logic, I reflected. Indeed, the criminal mind often mistakes complexity for cleverness, forgetting that each additional element provides another opportunity for detection. Holmes smiled with quiet satisfaction. The man who died twice has taught us that the most elaborate deceptions crumble before the simple application of methodical observation and logical deduction. The morning light grew stronger as we sat in contemplative silence. The extraordinary case finally laid to rest through the inexorable power of reason over impossibility. Several weeks had passed since Julian Thorne's arrest, and the November fog that had shrouded our extraordinary investigation had given way to the crisp clarity of December mornings. Holmes had returned to his familiar routines with characteristic intensity, dividing his time between chemical experiments and the cataloguing of tobacco ash varieties. Yet I sensed that some element of the Pembroke case continued to occupy his thoughts, manifesting in occasional moments of distant contemplation that interrupted his usual focused energy. The resolution came in the form of an urgent summons from Lady Pembroke, requesting our immediate attendance at Pembroke House regarding discoveries made among her late husband's private papers. We found her in the morning room where we had first examined Thomas Blackwood's bodice, as though the chamber had been transformed by winter sunlight streaming through tall windows, dispelling the shadows of the tragic evening. "Gentlemen," she began without preamble, gesturing toward a leather portfolio upon the mahogany table, "I have uncovered documents that cast an entirely new light upon recent events. My husband was far more aware of the conspiracy surrounding him than any of us realized." Holmes opened the portfolio with careful precision, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to intense concentration as he examined the contents. Among Sir Reginald's papers were detailed correspondence with a Liverpool inquiry agent, comprehensive reports on Julian Thorne's financial irregularities, and most remarkably, documentation of Thomas Blackwood's uncanny resemblance to the baronet himself. "Extraordinary," Holmes murmured, passing me a letter dated 3 weeks before Sir Reginald's death. "Your husband knew about Arthur's impersonation scheme before it was ever attempted. He was conducting his own investigation into Julian's fraudulent activities." The final document in the collection proved most illuminating, a letter addressed to Holmes himself, written on the afternoon of Sir Reginald's death but never posted. In elegant script, the baronet explained his plan to use Arthur's desperate scheme as a trap to expose Julian's conspiracy. He had intended to allow the impersonation to proceed, gathering witnesses and evidence to spring his trap at the crucial moment. Sir Reginald underestimated his nephew's ruthlessness, I observed, understanding the tragic irony. He anticipated fraud or embezzlement, but not murder. Holmes nodded gravely. He believed that family loyalty would prevent Julian from crossing that final threshold into violence. It was both noble and fatal miscalculation. Lady Pembroke's composure wavered slightly. Reginald always saw the best in people, even when they least deserved it. In this instance, his faith in human decency became his undoing. Yet his sacrifice was not meaningless, Holmes replied, his voice carrying unusual warmth. The evidence he gathered has exposed the railway conspiracy and protected those small investors he sought to defend. His death achieved the justice he pursued, albeit at terrible cost. Our return to Baker Street was interrupted by the arrival of several items that provided the final emotional resonance to our extraordinary case. Among them was a letter bearing a Liverpool postmark, addressed in an unpracticed hand. Holmes passed it to me with a slight nod, recognizing immediately its significance. Mrs. Blackwood's letter, written in simple yet heartfelt language, expressed profound gratitude for the anonymous fund that had been established for her family's welfare. She spoke movingly of her late husband's pride in his musical abilities and his dreams for their children's future. "He would have been astonished," she wrote, "to know that gentlemen of learning and position would concern themselves with the welfare of a music-hall violinist's widow." Holmes folded the letter with unusual care, his grey eyes reflecting that rare display of emotion I had learned to recognize in moments of genuine human connection. "There, Watson. Is praise more valuable than any newspaper column? The world seldom recognizes the smaller justices that lie behind sensational cases, yet it is often upon those that I place the highest value." A second package contained an elegant gold pocket watch engraved with the Pembroke crest, accompanied by Lady Pembroke's note confirming that Sarah Brennan had been not only reinstated, but promoted within the household. The wrongly dismissed servant would face no further difficulties regarding her employment prospects. Holmes examined the timepiece with appreciation before placing it upon our mantelpiece, where it joined other mementos of our adventures. Justice takes many forms, Watson. While the law concerns itself with punishment, true resolution requires restoration. The balance has been reset. He moved to his violin and drew the bow across the strings, filling our chambers with the delicate strains of a melancholy air that seemed to honor both Sir Reginald's courage and Thomas Blackwood's innocent sacrifice. When the final note faded, Holmes set the instrument aside with characteristic precision. "The case demonstrates admirably that complexity in crime often masks fundamental simplicity in motive," he observed. "Julian Thorne constructed an elaborate illusion, thinking thereby to cheat both law and conscience. But illusion cannot long withstand fact, and it is our privilege to hasten that inevitable collision." As evening approached and the gas lamps began to flicker to life throughout London, Holmes turned his attention to a telegram regarding the mysterious disappearance of prize orchids from a greenhouse in Kent. The adventure of the man who died twice had reached its conclusion, but in the great metropolis beyond our door, countless other mysteries awaited the singular mind of Sherlock Holmes. The game, as always, remained afoot. The winter frost had transformed London into a crystalline wonderland, replacing the suffocating November fog with air so crisp it seemed to ring like a bell with each breath. Within our Baker Street chambers, I sat at my writing desk, putting the final flourishes to my account of the extraordinary Pembroke affair. The ink glistened wetly on the page as I completed the last sentence, describing how reason had triumphed over impossibility through the inexorable application of logic and observation. Holmes occupied his customary position by the fire, the Pembroke watch gleaming on the mantelpiece above him like a golden reminder of justice achieved. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, and I recognized the contemplative mood that invariably followed the successful resolution of a particularly complex case. Our peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of Arthur Pembroke, whose appearance had undergone a remarkable transformation since that fog-bound evening when we first encountered him in terror and desperation. Prison had stripped away his earlier arrogance, replacing it with a gravity that spoke of genuine moral awakening. His face bore the pallor of confinement, yet his eyes carried a clarity of purpose that suggested hard-won wisdom. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, accepting the chair I offered with hands that trembled only slightly. "I've come to express gratitude that mere words cannot convey. Your testimony regarding Julian's manipulation proved instrumental in reducing my sentence, but more importantly, you prevented an innocent man from hanging for crimes he did not commit." Holmes waved away the thanks with characteristic dismissiveness. "Justice required accurate attribution of guilt, Mr. Pembroke. Your actions were foolish and criminal, but they did not extend to murder." Arthur set down his brandy glass, his fingers nervously tracing patterns on the worn leather. "I've had considerable time for reflection. The gambling debts that drove me to such desperate measures now seem absurdly trivial compared to their consequences. Uncle Reginald would have helped me had I possessed the courage to confess honestly. Pride often proves more destructive than the sins it attempts to conceal, I observed, recognizing the universal human tendency to compound error through shame. Indeed, Doctor, I thought myself clever in arranging the impersonation, never imagining Julian was orchestrating murder using my desperation as cover. Thomas Blackwood died because I provided the opportunity. Arthur's voice broke slightly. That innocent musician's blood stains my conscience as surely as if I had administered the poison myself. Holmes leaned forward, studying the young man with penetrating intensity. Guilt acknowledged is the first step toward redemption. Mr. Pembroke, the question becomes what you intend to do with the years remaining. I have been corresponding with Mrs. Blackwood through my solicitor. When released, I intend to establish a trust fund for her children's education, not from family money, which I have forfeited, but from my own honest labor. I shall work to repay a debt I can never truly discharge. Holmes rose and selected a slim volume from his bookshelf. Before you go, accept this small gift, Essays on Moral Philosophy. You will find within perspectives useful during the difficult years ahead. After Arthur's departure, I turned to Holmes with curiosity. That was remarkably generous. I did not expect such compassion towards someone whose foolishness contributed so significantly to the tragedy. Holmes returned to his chair, reaching for his pipe. Arthur demonstrates genuine understanding of his moral failure, Watson. Unlike Julian, who showed neither remorse nor conscience even facing the gallows, Arthur possesses the capacity for redemption. The book provides philosophical foundation upon which practical wisdom must be built. He packed his pipe with deliberate slowness, the ritual aiding the organization of his thoughts. This case demonstrates how crime creates ripples extending far beyond immediate victims. Julian's greed destroyed not only his uncle and an innocent musician, but damaged countless lives through financial conspiracy. Yet those same ripples, properly understood, allow us to trace criminality to its source. The evening deepened around us as Holmes continued his reflections. The most elaborate deceptions are often undone by trivial details, Watson. A musician's callus, a patch of clay, blood on a cuff's inside surface. The universe has a distinct preference for order, and when crime forces disorder upon it, the universe invariably leaves marks of the intrusion. I glanced at my completed manuscript, then at the Pembroke watch catching firelight on the mantelpiece. The impossible had been rendered explicable, the ghosts laid to rest through pure reason. Yet I knew this tranquility was merely an interlude. The great city around us held its breath, preparing to exhale new mysteries. Holmes suddenly sprang from his chair, moving toward his chemical table with renewed vigor. That telegram regarding the Kentish orchids, Watson. I have been considering the soil composition of that district. I closed my portfolio with a smile, watching as the world's greatest consulting detective plunged headlong into his next puzzle. The adventure of the man who died twice had taken its place in our archives, another victory for logic over impossibility, reason over deception, and ultimately, justice over the darkest impulses of human nature. The final resolution of our extraordinary case arrived not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet satisfaction that accompanies justice properly served. 3 months had passed since Julian Thorne's execution, and the winter sun streamed through our Baker Street windows as Holmes completed his final examination of the documents recovered from the condemned man's cell. The leather portfolio before him contained not merely confessions, but a meticulous accounting of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every stolen pound that had fueled the conspiracy. Remarkable, Holmes murmured, setting aside the last page of Thorne's handwritten testament. Even facing the gallows, his obsession with precision remained undiminished. These records will allow the Crown to recover nearly every penny stolen from the small investors Sir Reginald sought to protect. I moved to examine the documents myself, marveling at their thoroughness. He documented his own crimes with scientific accuracy. pride, Watson. Even in defeat, Thorne could not resist demonstrating the sophistication of his scheme. Yet this vanity serves justice admirably. The recovered assets will provide restitution far exceeding the original investments. A soft knock interrupted our examination. Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Lady Pembroke, who entered with a dignity that spoke of grief transformed into purposeful resolve. She carried a small velvet box which she placed upon our table with ceremonial gravity. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion it carried, "I bring news that my husband would have cherished. The Board of Trade has implemented new regulations based upon the evidence you uncovered. No railway merger may proceed without independent audit, and investor protection measures have been strengthened considerably." Holmes accepted the box with characteristic courtesy, revealing within a pair of elegant cufflinks bearing the Pembroke crest. "Sir Reginald's legacy extends far beyond his immediate family, Lady Pembroke. His final stand against corruption has protected countless innocents. There is more," she continued. "Arthur has written from prison. His conduct has been exemplary, and the governor expects early release for good behavior. More importantly, he has been corresponding with Mrs. Blackwood. The trust fund he established for her children has grown substantially through careful investment, and young Thomas Blackwood, Jr. has shown remarkable musical talent." Holmes's expression softened perceptibly. "Justice takes many forms. The boy inherits not merely financial support, but his father's artistic gifts freed from the constraints of poverty." After Lady Pembroke's departure, Holmes moved to the fireplace, where he carefully fed Thorne's confessions to the flames. The pages curled and blackened, their secrets having served their purpose in restoring the moral balance that crime had disturbed. "You destroy the evidence?" I asked, surprised by this unusual action. "The legal authorities possess copies of everything significant. These personal reflections served only to satisfy my own curiosity regarding Thorne's psychology." Holmes watched the final page crumble to ash. He was a man of considerable intelligence corrupted by an inability to distinguish between cleverness and wisdom. His elaborate scheme collapsed because he confused complexity with perfection. Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his violin, drawing from it a melody that seemed to honor both the dead and the living. Sir Reginald's noble sacrifice, Thomas Blackwood's innocent participation, and even Arthur Pembroke's hard-won redemption. When the final note faded, he set the instrument aside with characteristic precision. "The case demonstrates admirably the interconnected nature of human actions, Watson. A young man's gambling debts, a musician's uncanny resemblance, a chemist's desperate greed, all wove together into a pattern that appeared impossible until properly examined. Yet beneath the surface, complexity lay the eternal struggle between honor and avarice." I completed my final notes as the afternoon light began to fade, transforming our familiar chambers into a study of amber and shadow. The Pembroke watch gleamed on the mantelpiece beside other mementos of our adventures, each representing a victory of reason over chaos, justice over corruption. "The man who died twice has taught us that truth possesses a gravity that inevitably draws all deceptions into its orbit," Holmes observed, already reaching for the evening papers where new mysteries awaited discovery. "No matter how elaborate the illusion, reality remains constant, patient, and ultimately triumphant." As gas lamps flickered to life throughout London, I reflected on the extraordinary journey from impossibility to understanding. What had begun as a supernatural paradox had revealed itself as an all-too-human tragedy of greed and desperation, yet through Holmes's brilliant deductions, it had become something more, a reaffirmation that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find its mark. Outside our window, the great city hummed with countless lives intersecting in patterns of light and shadow. And within our chambers at Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes prepared himself for whatever challenges the dawn might bring, secure in the knowledge that no mystery could long withstand the patient application of logic and unwavering dedication to truth. The game, as always, remained eternally afoot.